My guest today, Mayor Michael Tubbs, who is the youngest mayor of any major city in the United States and also doing some extraordinarily important work and how to give people hope. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for being with us. You are mayor of Stockton, California, 300 and somebody, how many thousands of people?
320,000 people.
And you're only 17 years old?
I'm 28.
28.
I'm getting older by the second.
From my vantage point, 28, 17 is not that. I mean, before we get into the substance, and you're doing some really extraordinary things, and I think they are really at the forefront of public policy. But before we get into it, I just want to know how somebody who is 28 years old or 27 when you were elected can become the mayor of a major city. How do you do it?
Oh, man. It's a good question, I think. Well, it started actually during my senior year in college. I decided to run for city council. And partly it was because the year before, I was interning in the White House. My job was working with mayors and councils. And I didn't enjoy the job necessarily, but I saw, this is in 2010, so it's like the Tea Party had just taken back the House. There's a lot of like stalemate at the federal level. But I saw at the local level, these mayors and council members were doing amazing things for towns of 100,000, 200,000, 400,000 people. So then I started thinking that maybe the locus of change in this country can be federal, but it's hard to make change for half a billion people. It's a lot easier to make it for 300,000 people in the city.
And you had no way of knowing Donald Trump was going to be
president. No crystal ball there.
Uh-huh.
And then around the same time, one of my cousins, while I was interning in the White House, actually was sadly a victim of a homicide in Stockton. So I think it was also that juxtaposition between being at top school, being at the White House, but my family back home literally is dying, and how was my personal success doing anything to make their lives better? So decided to run for city council. I won, so I spent 4 years on city council.
So you went directly from college to city council in your hometown, and it was easy to get on the city council. I mean, you were 22 years old.
Yeah, no, running for city council in many respects was, I think, a lot more difficult than running for mayor, in that I had some relationships, but I had not been in the political scene in Stockton, so I had to build those relationships. I had never worked on a campaign before, so I had to learn how to run a campaign and resource allocation, and I don't come from money, so the fundraising part was a challenge. I'm like, I used to always say, I don't like asking broke people for money. How do we? So that was very challenging, but it taught me so much about how just getting on the ground game, the door knocking, even going to people who may not vote every election, but will vote if you give them something to vote for, how powerful that was. So we ended up being the top vote getter of all folks running for city council at the time in 2012.
I love you use the pronoun we. I mean, it was you, but it is a team, right? It is a team effort. You and others were the top vote getter for the city council.
For city council. And then 4 years later, it was a little bit easier because I spent 4 years as an elected official. So I had a record to run on.
Right.
We finally had a rebuttal to the he's too young. And we would say, well, age and experience are two different things. And I've been on the city council for 4 years. And this is what I've done with the council, also what I've done individually. And we also finally were able to have some relationships that made the fundraising a little bit easier. And we ran a really good ground game again, where we were ended up, because there was 8 people in the primary, and I was the last person to get into the race. So by the time it was for the primary, people would get upset and hang up on us because we had called 4, 5, 6 times just to make sure that folks know we were on the ballot, we needed their vote. We ended up winning the primary by like 9 points, and then we won the general with 72% of the vote against the incumbent. So it was just ground campaign, door knocking, and then understanding that so much that people want to they don't want to be lied to, but they want to have a reason for hope. And just saying like things are bad isn't good enough, I don't think, to motivate folks to get engaged and involved.
Well, let's get into that reason for hope, because you come in, you're mayor of Stockton, California. Stockton has a lot of problems. I don't know whether people are enormously hopeful there now. I hope they are, but there wasn't a great deal of hope there before you were on the city council and were growing up there. So how do you give them hope? What are you thinking about as policies that will advance the ball?
Well, it's funny. I think it's been 18 months. A lot of the hope we've given has really been in the public-private partnership space. So one of the first things we announced this year was a program called the Stockton Scholars, where we're able to get a donation from the California Community Foundation, of $20 million over 5 years, so that now every kid who graduates from our largest school district is guaranteed a scholarship of $1,000 a year for 4 years if they go straight to a 4-year school, or $500 for 2 years if they go to a 2-year school, or $500 for 2 years if they go to a trade school. And for me, that's like real. I think hope has to be tangible, and that's something really tangible that folks can say, okay, my kid graduates guaranteed. So that's one way. But I think also,
And before we go on, I just want to. Do you have any? You just started that. Is it all? I mean, do you have reason to think it's working?
yeah, well, already we've seen our school district has now passed an A through G for all policy. When before the Stockton Scholars program was announced, only 33% of our kids could even apply to go to a great school like Berkeley or Sac State or any UC or CSU. But now we see parents and kids asking counselors for A through G courses in the district saying in the next couple of years, we're going to go A through G for all, which is a conversation we've been trying to have for 6 years. But now with something real tangible, the system began to work.
It's terrific. But even though $1,000 is not exactly going to, it's not going to go a long way, given the cost of higher education. But it does help psychologically. I mean, it's a sort of a boost, an incentive, right?
But what's been really interesting in talking to maybe not so much the UCLA, but talking to the Cal State Chancellor, his financial aid office did some research for us and found that because of the high levels of poverty in Stockton, that for 89 to 90% of kids in that school district, that $1,000 would be enough to make tuition completely free on top of Cal grants, Pell grants, et cetera. So there's a $1,000 tuition gap. So for 90% of the kids in our school district, any CSU is going to be tuition free. They have to pay.
That's a huge.
So
that's a huge
that's and for some of the other students, it's around just having flexibility for books or laptops or some of the other expenses that come with being in college. But to your point, I think the biggest benefit is this psychological thing around expectations. So now the expectations that all our kids are doing something after high school.
Yeah.
I think it also, as a kid who grew up in Stockton and felt like I had to leave and felt that the city had done things to me but not for me, I think for a lot of them, there's a pride. Like, I'm a Stockton scholar. Like, my city values my brain, my potential, and is actually putting real dollars to it. So I'm excited for the next decade to see sort of who those students become, and I'm sure they'll come back and run for mayor or be doctors or professors or just be good ambassadors for the city, even if they don't come back.
Well, I mean, that's one big point of hope you've created already. Anything else you're doing?
I think this one's a lot more difficult, but we're really focused on gun violence and homicides, which is just part of me is like, it's a hard thing to really champion because it's a lot of it's not in your control, but it's so important and so personal. So we've seen significant reductions this year, but still not where we need to be. But we're adding programs like we have a ceasefire program and another program we're bringing in called Advanced Peace. And both of these programs really focus on the less than 1% of our population that drives 80% of our violent crime and really provides them hope in terms of opportunity. So I think when I use the word hope, I'm really speaking to opportunity and figuring out how do we create more opportunity and do small things well so people feel a reason to be excited.
So if I can just make sure I understand, you're saying that there's a small group of people they're responsible for 80% of the violent crime, and if you can identify them and not do what many mayors and others would do, just lock them up, you actually want to help them see an alternative path.
Yeah, well, what we found is that we spend so much money, like these less than 1% of our population control our image, our narrative, like violence. It's not 300,000 people. It's 200 people who we know because most of them are on probation or parole. Most of them have been in and out of jail 5 or 6 times. So they interact with our systems anyway. So the strategy now is understanding that police and law enforcement aren't going anywhere and jails aren't going anywhere. And we've tried that and it hasn't worked in the way we want it to work. Let's flood them with the same attention from social workers and therapists and skills and jobs like we do with cops. and let's see if that makes some changes. And the city of Richmond instituted the Advanced Peace Program and saw significant reductions over a decade. The city of Oakland has seen their gun violence and shootings go down. over the last several years instituting the ceasefire program. So I'm hopeful that with time we'll see that not everyone is going to change, and and that's why there's still police in jails. But that I truly believe that people really respond to like real opportunity, not fake opportunity, but like a real opportunity that's tangible and allows folks to change.
Well, that gets us to another initiative that you're involved in, and that is a guaranteed income experiment, or at least a pilot program. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we're running a pilot called the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. It's funded partly by a donation from the Economic Security Project. We're also raising money on top of it. And the idea is that starting in February, 100 families in Stockton will receive $500 a month for 18 months. We have evaluators from University of Pennsylvania and University of Tennessee that are going to be looking at sort of how the money is spent, how does it change kind of their finances, but also kind of feelings of stress, anxiety, etc. But really, it gets to the heart of what I think is the major issue in Stockton. It's this idea that 23% of my population lives in poverty. I would argue another 25% are one paycheck away from poverty. And that's not just a Stockton issue. It's a national one, as you know. When 1 in 2 Americans can afford one $500 emergency, and you have everything's going up but wages. In Stockton, for example, the last year, rent has risen 22%, income has declined 8%, and people are still having to figure out how to do it. So we're just the motivation came from, well, the idea came from actually reading Dr. King in college and him calling for a guaranteed
This
income.
is not a new idea.
It's not a new idea at all.
I mean, Martin Luther King was calling for it, but some conservatives.
Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman. You're a follower of Milton Friedman.
I'm a follower of Jesus, but no, I'm glad Milton Friedman.
Jesus was calling for a minimum income as well.
Or for us not to be having people work themselves to death. For sure.
But you say $500 a month for 100 families. How do you select the 100 families? Or is it purely random?
It's partly random. So what our researchers have decided what they would do is create an algorithm so anyone who lives in a census tract in the city that's at or below the area median income qualifies.
Qualifies for the pool?
Qualifies for the pool.
To be part of the selected and this random draw.
You're a professor. You get it. Absolutely.
Well, I don't.
I don't know
that I got it at all.
That's essentially what they're doing. And for me, it's important that, number one, it's need in the Stocktons not. There's some geographies historically that have had more need, but now we have pockets of poverty and folks who are working and struggling everywhere throughout the city. So I want everyone to have a benefit there. And then number two, I think it's important, especially as a demonstration, and we challenge notions of worthiness and us versus them and who was part of this idea of the commons. We felt it was very important that the pool was reflective of all of Stockton. So it's not just all Black people or all Latino people or all white people that get it, or all Asian people that receive it, but as reflective as possible of the diversity of our city so that everyone can see themselves in this being a good idea versus it becoming something that's given to those folks, but not to me. And that's why I'm struggling and things are unfair for me.
Well, it's interesting but the way you described it, there will be people who are randomly selected, and then there will be a control group, I assume, of people who are not randomly selected, and you can compare, researchers can see, a year or 2 or 3 in, how the behavior, if any, has changed among people who got the $500 from the people who didn't. And if it's both random, then it's scientifically valid.
Yeah, and that's what's really exciting, because over the past year, we've been having this conversation about basic income and whether to do it or not. And it's been very frustrating because much of the conversation isn't rooted, and even the evidence that exists today from studies done with the Eastern Band of Native Americans or the Alaskan Permanent Dividend Fund, but it's always rooted in folks' notions of what they think people would do with the money. So
I keep hearing, I'll tell you, when this first came up to me and to my attention, people were saying, well, if people get $500 a month, they're going to be lazy. They're just going to use it on drink, or, they're going to just, and, I remember thinking to myself, well, people work hard. They $500 they're going to use to help pay their expenses. It's going to be a positive motivator. Why should you assume it's going to be a negative motivator? I mean, do you come across that kind of response?
All the time. And I think that's what excites me most, is that in 18 months, I can speak to, this is actually what people, make your own judgments, whether it's good or bad, but this is actually, in the real world, at least in this city, what folks were using the money for. And the amount of focus groups we've done over the past year, I expect to see people use it on like transportation costs, increase them hearing from folks about the cost of childcare, and after school care, healthcare costs, and rent. And then given how hard people work and how stressful life can be, if folks want to buy a glass of wine with their $500 a month, they should. They should
Let them do whatever
get them.
whatever they want. I mean, what the thing that about this guaranteed income that appeals to a lot of conservatives, and I talk to conservatives, they say it's better than any kind of welfare program because with most of the assistance, welfare assistance, it's for housing or for food. You honor human dignity by saying you decide what you want to do with this money. You know, it shouldn't be government making that decision. But then we are up against the next question, which is how do you afford it? Now, this money, your money, is coming from a foundation that is, but could we ever do this on a large scale?
I think we could. I think it would have to be iteratively. I don't think you can roll out for everybody tomorrow. But there's already been some conversations at the state level to modernize the earned income tax credit. Include 1099 workers and students in that as a form of a guaranteed income for folks who make less than 50K or below or 75K or below in the state, which I think could be a great start. And I think and some of my other folks, I love the line they use that when it's time to do something that helps the majority of people, the question of price tag becomes prohibitive. But when it comes to things like tax cuts or endless wars, the question of price never comes up. It's almost like that there's a mandate to do that. So I think part of the conversation I hope to have is really flipping and saying, well, if this is something we value, if we think in the richest country in the world that folks shouldn't have the bottom come out from underneath them, that we should give folks just the basics and they could build on top of that, then how can we not afford it? Like what do we need to do? And I think it goes back to your idea of this getting back to the common good and that being part of the social contract and part of what we have in common. That is by virtue of being folks in this community or in this country, this is what we've earned it and deserved. And there's also conversation around some sort of data tax or some sort of carbon tax or some sort of tax on financial transactions that aren't.
Listen, if we put a tax on carbon and put a tax on financial transactions, we would have in this country more than enough to do a basic guaranteed income for everyone, and we might even eliminate poverty, but you're not going to eliminate motivation and incentive to work hard. You're just going to give somebody and some families the minimum.
It's going to reward people who work hard, because I think oftentimes, and you know this, the folks who are struggling the most in this economy were literally working themselves to death, working 2 or 3 jobs in the gig economy, stress, anxious, not taking care of themselves, not eating right. I was looking at the data the other day, and the majority of there's a high number of folks in poverty who aren't working because they're kids. We have child labor laws, and 33% of folks who are in poverty are children. But most people who are able-bodied and can work do work, and oftentimes are working full-time jobs with no benefit. Anyway, let me get my.
That's what I saw, and I have seen. Speaking of work, you have work to do, and I don't want to take too much of your time. But Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us. Thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you for doing it at the age you're doing it. And I expect you are just beginning a very important and very noble political career, and I thank you for that as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me and the work you've done for decades and decades.
Too many decades.